Welcome to Business Authority Radio, bringing you insights from today's thought leaders, professionals, and influencers. With your hosts, Neil Howe and Craig Williams.
Hello and welcome to the show. This is your host, Neil Howe, and today my guest is James Warren. Now, James is a Washington, D.C. tax attorney who helps people and businesses deal with complex tax issues and transactions. Everything from fighting the IRS in court to how structuring a new business or forming a charity works. So let's talk about some of these issues. Welcome to the show, James Warren.
Neil, good morning. Very good to be on the show. Delighted to talk with you.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself and the company that you work for and the clients that you help.
Thank you, Neil. I should start by explaining that I have a very English accent and a very American job. I grew up in England, and although I have lived in the United States for the last 30 years or more, I still sound like I just got off the boat.
You do.
But for the last 31 years, as I've lived in this country, most of that time I have been a lawyer in private practice, working at a series of law firms, principally as a tax lawyer, a little bit as a corporate lawyer, and I've done some other things as well. Tax law is an interesting subject. As you said in your introduction, tax lawyers basically do two things. They help people plan transactions. They write about the transactions. They help people with the law that govern complex transactions. Sometimes they have to write down what the law is. They have to write opinions and explain to people what will happen if they do a transaction this way or they do it in a different way. And the second thing that tax lawyers do is to help people with their controversies when they get into trouble with the IRS or sometimes with the state taxing authorities, and they want to find their way through the system. People have odd ideas about tax lawyers, and when you tell people you're a tax lawyer, their people's eyes sort of glaze over. Most tax work is actually done by accountants, and that people tend to assume that tax lawyers do much the same thing that accountants do. That is to say, they prepare tax returns. So people always say to me, "Are you busy the first couple of weeks in April?" I'm not particularly busy the first couple of weeks in April because, by and large, I don't do tax returns. As I say, I help people with transactions, I advise transactions. Sometimes I have to advise people a little bit about what to put on their tax return, but it's not really my job to do tax returns in the normal course, so I don't have a big tax return practice. Where I come in useful to people is when they get audited, or they're in the audit process, they're talking to the IRS or the state authorities, and things are starting to go wrong. The auditor comes through and starts asking a lot of awkward questions. Maybe you don't have the records. And they decide that they have a live one. So they start to raise issues. And this culminates in a process where they issue you a notice saying that you owe a large amount in income tax, which they may be right about or they may not be right about. So if you want to fight about this, if you want to challenge the IRS or challenge the auditor, then you need help. In my experience, people don't ask for help as soon as they need it. You can work very often with the accountant who prepared the return, and that will get you some of the way. But if you really want to fight, you have a complex fight about the facts, or you have a fight about the law, you may need the services of somebody who is a professional tax attorney, who did not prepare the return and with whom you will have complete attorney-client privilege.
So those are some distinct differences then from what people may think. Just like you said, that the tax attorney deals with all tax-related issues, but really it's only when you have a problem and you need to find out, the experience that you have to go to the IRS and to, be there on behalf of the taxpayer to work that out. So yes, you have other advice, but mainly you're there to fix these problems when the IRS calls.
Yes, indeed. Taking on the IRS is really quite a challenge. When you get a notice from the IRS, it will tell you exactly what to do, and it will give you a deadline. In my experience, people aren't very good at doing exactly what the IRS wants you to do, and they don't take the deadlines seriously. Tax law is full of deadlines. It says you have to do this by such and such a day or within so many days of this notice. And very often people don't realize that a day late is often a day too late. You will lose the rights to contest the issue at this level, and therefore you have to take it up to the next level. And you're losing the opportunity to have the matter reviewed and to challenge the determination because you have not acted swiftly enough. Very often you can get an extension, but you have to ask for the extension. You often have to ask for the extension in writing. So people discover that if they try to sort this out themselves, that generally they just sink deeper and deeper into the morass. The tax problems do not go away because you ignore them. People sort of like to think that, well, if I don't do anything, it'll go quiet and then I won't hear from them again. And then another letter arrives, and this time it's got worse. And this time there've been penalties added, and then there's interest on the penalties, and then there's interest on the interest. And the numbers get bigger and bigger, and it gets harder and harder to deal with the system. And at that point, people finally decide, okay, now I need serious help. So I will, as people often do when they have problems in life, they go to say, I can't sleep at night, so I'm going to give this to a lawyer, and he can't sleep at night, and I will sleep soundly because I've given this matter to somebody who knows how to do this.
And I think that is the biggest thing. It's, tax law is extremely complicated, and there's lots of rules that change all the time. But there's systems that, as a tax attorney, that you can deal with the IRS by following this system. And, people that get these letters, yes, they might be fearful and anxiety-ridden when they get a letter from the IRS. But, it's not like a bill that you get in the mail that can be a couple of days late and no consequences. It's something that needs taken care of right away.
That's right. And the IRS is actually quite helpful if you deal with them properly. They actually prefer to deal with tax professionals, lawyers and accountants who do this kind of work, rather than deal with the taxpayer, because when the taxpayer gets to talk to the IRS, they're usually upset and they're angry and they're frustrated and they don't think it's fair. And the IRS does not particularly like dealing with people who have that kind of attitude and are in that sort of mood. Whereas if they deal with a lawyer or an accountant, they know that they're dealing with a professional, generally somebody who has worked within the system, who understands how the system works. And it's a lot easier to work things out. And they will work things out. But in my experience, they work things out better if you know what your rights are and you are willing to stand up to them. I've had quite a lot of experience. I used to work for a big Wall Street law firm before Potomac Law Group. I've been involved in disputes that involve many millions of dollars. And the IRS can dig in their heels like any institution. They tend to back each other up as you go up the chain. But they need to know that you will actually challenge what they have to say. So it's often the case that you can get the case to the point that it's actually outside the IRS. It's in, say, the United States Tax Court, which is the next port of call. Once you get out of the administrative system, you get into the judicial system. And you file your petition in the tax court. The case eventually gets set for trial. You will find that on Sunday afternoon, before the trial starts on Monday, the IRS is often in quite an accommodating mood because they do not like to be taken to court, and they certainly don't like to be taken to court and lose. And whereas they've been digging their heels in all along and saying, well, we won't give you anything at all, when when confronted with the realization that a tax lawyer who really knows what he's doing is going to be there on Monday morning ready to present the evidence and the facts and the law and demonstrate that the taxpayer does not in fact owe this tax that the IRS is saying, at that point they're saying, well, maybe we'll split it with you, But you have to make them afraid of you. They have to know that you're really going to do it. And in that, actually, lawyers have an advantage over accountants because accountants are not really in the business of taking cases to court and challenging the IRS in a big way, whereas they know that lawyers who do this for a living are willing to do that to them and, sometimes chalk up big, humiliating, at least from the IRS's point of view, humiliating victories.
Mm-hmm. And I think if you're trying to do this yourself or even with an accountant, you've got to realize that the IRS is not there for your best interest. They're trying to collect money for themselves. Therefore, they're not going to tell you all the things that you need to know in order to get the best result. However, a tax attorney like yourself is going to know that law.
Yeah, I mean, this is true. That they don't. They do try to be helpful. The IRS has an enormous website that has vast amounts of information on it, and it is actually it's extremely informative. The information is not secret. The whole Internal Revenue Code and all the regulations are up there on the web. Anybody can look at it. The trouble is that the code and the regulations together are several times the length of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
It's a vast amount. I'm not sure that anybody alive has actually read it all. I'm pretty sure there's nobody alive who's actually read the regulations from one end to the other. But the tax law has a certain logic to it, which may not be apparent to most taxpayers. To become a tax lawyer, you really, you need to take several courses in law school in tax. And then you need to live with the system, work with it day in and day out for at least a couple of years, and you start to see how the whole thing fits together. There is a logic to it. But there are many grey areas as well. It's full of what one of my old law professors used to call gaps, conflicts, and ambiguities. There are many things that are not entirely clear, which is really an important skill from a legal point of view, in that, as I say, we don't do numbers, we don't do tax returns for the most part. But we do the words, and there are many places where the words are not entirely clear. There's many places, where something has to be reasonable, but you can argue about what reasonable is. What seems reasonable to the IRS may not be reasonable from the taxpayer's point of view. And the world has always moved on from where the tax law is. Income tax is an old artifact in a sense. It started in 1913, and it's been added to by accretion year after year after year, with important statutes and regulations coming out time after time. But many things that are happening in the real world transactions are happening in today's world. And then when you come to look at what the tax law is that relates to this situation, well, it was something that was written in the 1950s, where they obviously didn't contemplate the internet. They didn't contemplate businesses being done online by remote transactions in a way that happen nowadays. And so it is a legal skill to try to persuade the IRS or persuade a court that something that was never contemplated by the tax law should be treated in this way or treated in that way. And that is primarily a legal skill. That is not an accounting matter. So, I like to say to people, we don't do numbers, we do words.
Excellent. So the IRS obviously is a big issue, and that's what most people think about when they go to see a tax attorney. But what else do you do? You help people with a different business structure and finding the best way to organize their businesses? Yes, indeed.
At the most elemental level, people come in and say, yes, I've got a business, I've got a new business, or I've got a small business and I want to make it a big business, and I want to know what will happen. What will happen if I set up an LLC, a limited liability company? What will happen if I set up a regular corporation, what's called a C corporation? What will happen if I set up what's called an S corporation, which is a corporation which is taxed a bit like a partnership? Or what happens if I have a partnership? There are pluses and minuses to all of these things, and they're all taxed in completely different ways. One instance where people are taxed in different ways that may be familiar to listeners is, the difference between being an employee or being an independent contractor. If you're an independent contractor, it's really someone who has his own business. If you work for somebody, they generally just send you a check, and it's your responsibility as the independent contractor to pay tax on that and to do all the withholding, pay estimated taxes. If you're a W-2 employee, then your employer is supposed to do all the deductions and pay you the net of whatever is left from this. There have been big fights that have gone on in recent years as to which side of the line people actually fall, with FedEx drivers and exotic dancers and some other interesting categories of people who in some ways seem to have a job, but in other ways seem to be independent operators. So you have those sorts of things. Then you have bigger transactions that arise where you've got complicated transactions where people want to divide up a business, or they want to sell a business, or a big corporation wants to come in and take over a business, or people want to issue debt or equity in the markets. Again, the tax consequences of this tend to be serious, they tend to be long-lasting, and the system is full of traps for the unwary. This is particularly true if you have international dimensions to this. The taxation of international transactions is very complex. It's not a system that is well known to most people. But there are very detailed and complex rules, many of which are really rather out of date because much of this was done in the 60s, about what happens if a US business sets up an operation in a foreign country, and what happens if if a corporation in a foreign country decides to set up and start doing business in the United States. So, if you're going to start doing business in foreign countries, or you're going to start working with, subsidiaries or affiliates in foreign countries, that is something you need to know what the tax law is going to be. You mentioned earlier that the tax law changes a lot. The recent tax law has changed, in particular, the rules that relate to multinational corporations. So where you have say a big US conglomerate, big US corporation that has subsidiaries in foreign countries. Many of those have reduced their US tax liability in the past by keeping their offshore earnings away from the United States so that they don't have to pay tax on them. But the tax law has just changed so that in effect they are going to be taxed on all of it anyway, and they now have to bring it back. Well, there are huge complexities in the details of exactly how that is going to play out. And so people look for guidance on this, and they want to know that if we bring money back, if we do it this way or we do it that way, what will the tax consequences of that be? And they're very willing, in my experience, to pay quite large sums of money to have people analyze this in detail. Detail's important. You have to get into the details, right, to ascertain which is the better course of action.
And what has the recent tax law done as far as, the whole goal from what President Trump was saying is to get some of that money that's outside the country and bring it back? I know it's been early, but has that happened in your experience?
Yeah, it is definitely happening. What happened was, this is not tax evasion. This is, it was a legal situation. The big multinationals had vast amounts of money sitting in the Cayman Islands because these represented profits that had been earned in lower tax jurisdictions abroad. And if it came back to the United States, then you had to pay the extra to bring the total tax burden up to the United States level. Now there is a tax on all that income at a very generous rate, but it's going to have to be paid whether you bring the money back or not. So at this point, there is no purpose in keeping all the money back in the Cayman Islands anymore, and it will come back to the United States. The hope is that it will, generate economic growth, and that some good things will happen from it. But it was a crazy system. The system actually encouraged people to keep billions of dollars offshore. Right. In this fashion. So, so that's good. I may say on the recent tax law that, it has been very controversial. Not everybody is happy about the big tax relief that's been afforded to corporations and to very wealthy people. But many of the changes in it, if you actually look through the hundreds of pages of the law itself, many of these are sort of routine improvements and things that generally are simplifications of the code. I think it's an improvement on the international side. But everybody knows that the system is complicated and is too complicated. It's ridiculously complicated. On the other hand, somebody is invested in almost every sentence of it. And the minute you start to change anything, somebody's ox is being gored, and their lobbyists are straight round to their congressman in Washington to try to persuade them that nothing should change and the system is just perfect the way that it is. So it is actually very hard to reform the tax system. But simplification in general is good. I think the political controversy surrounding it has more to do with reducing the rates and the overall tax cost of what has been done, rather than the changes to the system. I would emphasize that most things have not actually changed. The basic architecture of the way that the law works outside of the international regime governing multinational corporations. The rest of it is, is all pretty much still there in place, and all those old rules from that go back to the 1920s and 30s. It's all still there. It's all still there.
Yeah. It's when you consider that these laws have been in place for decades, and things have changed and times have changed, you would think there'd be more updates to the law, for 2018 and beyond, but we're still using the same procedures from, almost 100 years ago now.
Yes, it would probably make sense in some ways to start again. But the difficulty is that the whole US economy has evolved around the tax code. And starting again would be massively disruptive to the investment industry, to the payroll industry, to everything. So it's not really an option to go back, even though the system that we have at the moment is probably suboptimal in many ways.
Yeah, not quite.
But it does change all the time. I mean, if you follow the tax press every day, there are new rulings, there are court decisions, there are, the courts sometimes decide that, they agree or disagree with the IRS, and the courts in different parts of the country take different positions on things. There are many subtleties to this, and it is a constantly moving thing.
Well, let's switch subject just for a few minutes and talk about charities. I know you do work with charities or tax-exempt organizations. And tell me a little bit about what some of the issues are with that.
Well, I work for a number of charities. I have always enjoyed doing what lawyers call pro bono work, that's to say working for people for nothing. And I do a lot of charity work, not all of it for nothing. Helping people to set up 501c3 organizations. People come in and they say, we want to set up a charity to work on some good cause or other. This typically involves forming a non-profit corporation, doing the corporate documents that are involved in setting that up. You need bylaws and you need resolutions and so on, mostly in a fairly standard form when you're just starting. And then you have to apply to the IRS for a ruling to say that you are actually a 501c3 organization. Sometimes that leads to some discussion when the IRS sees who you are and what you're doing. They like to ask some questions to do it. A lot of the ones that I do involve the Middle East. I have strong connections in the Arab and Muslim communities around Washington. And I go to Jordan twice a year. I'm a lawyer for a school in Jordan. And there's this terrible problem of the war in Syria. So I have groups that are trying to raise money in the United States to help with refugee issues, trying to provide education, humanitarian aid, and so forth. As you can imagine, when you tell the IRS that you're forming a charity, often with an Islamic-sounding name, and you're planning on sending money to Syria or to Lebanon, this does tend to provoke a few questions from the IRS as to who you are and what this is all about. It's perfectly legal for US people to set up a charity to do that sort of work, but you do have to jump through some hoops. You have to make sure that you're dealing with the right people, that you're not dealing with people who are on the terrorist list, that you're not in violation of the sanctions that apply to Syria, and there are many questions like that. But in general, people are surprised at how much paperwork goes with running a non-profit. You think it's not taxable, so you don't have to do anything. But the reality is that you do have to file a return of some sort every year. There are state law registration rules. You have to, if you're collecting funds in most of the states, you have to file for a license for charitable solicitation, just to prove that you're not knocking on doors and asking people in a fraudulent way for money. And generally, you just have to stay on top of it. If the organization gets to any size, it will want an office, and then it will need employees, and then you have issues surrounding employment and maybe real estate and so forth. But it is quite there's quite a significant legal and tax regime surrounding non-profits that, again, people generally have very little familiarity with and generally are in need of help with. So I do quite a lot. I very much enjoy working with charities and helping people to do these things. The Americans are very generous people. There are many people in this country. I mentioned particularly the Syrians. The Syrian community has been incredibly generous in opening their wallets and giving money to try to help the refugees in this terrible humanitarian situation that there is in Syria. But, you can't just have a meeting in the mosque on the phone after Friday prayers. You do have to set the thing up properly, and you have to have a board of directors, and you have to go through the hoops. And, I make it my job to try to make sure that people do it properly, and that, so that we don't have problems and we don't get a lot of questions asked that we're not able to answer.
That's right. If you stay within the rules, it's going to be a lot easier and plain sailing. So, well, James, you've given us a lot of great information here, but give us a story in your last 30 years or however long that you've been practicing tax law. What has stood out? What story really stands out in your mind? Somebody came to you with a problem. How were you able to solve that problem, and ultimately, what was the outcome for them?
Oh dear, that's a challenge. There are many things that I have done over the years. The story I would most like to tell relates to the situation that I look after in Jordan, where His Majesty King Abdullah many years ago was at Deerfield Academy in Massachusetts, and when he stopped being king, when he went back to Jordan and ultimately became king, he said that he wanted a school just like Deerfield in the Middle East to train the next generation of leaders in the region and in Jordan. And this came to me when I was at Sherman & Sterling, my former law firm, and I volunteered to help get this set up. So I set up a charity. It wasn't easy to persuade the IRS, who at that time were really very suspicious of this sort of thing, that we would that we could set up a charity, that the charity could actually own the school, and set up a subsidiary in Jordan. And so the school went from being just an idea to being what is now one of the great schools of the world. It was just a cucumber patch in the desert, and now it's a beautiful campus with 600, 700 students. They come from Jordan. They come from 23, 24 other countries. And I go to all the board meetings. I was just in a board meeting in New York. The trustees come from all over. And many exciting things have happened. Large sums of money have been raised, and I maintain the charity here. I make sure that everything stays well ordered, that the tax returns get filed, that all the reporting is done. And I think that it's one of the best things I've ever done. And when I ran into the king when I was last in Jordan, I said I thought this was one of the best things that he'd ever done too. And he gave me a quick hug, So that was one of the most rewarding things I've done, and that I've most enjoyed doing.
Excellent. Well, it's great to see when an idea can come to fruition, and you've definitely had your hand in that and making sure that everything is run smoothly. Well, James, I've really enjoyed our conversation today. Tell our listening audience what the best way is for them to get in touch with you if they have any questions or if they need some tax help.
Well, thank you, Neil. Yes, I'm not hard to find. My name is James F. Warren, and I probably best approached through Potomac Law Group. Potomac, like the name of the river. Potomac Law Group is a law firm of about 75 lawyers, all of whom used to have positions in-house or in big law firms. And you can find me on the attorneys there. There's a website that has everybody's picture and so forth. I think that's www.potomaclaw.com. That has my phone number, and you can get in touch with me in that way.
Excellent. Well, I enjoyed our conversation again. Thank you very much, James Warren, for being my guest on Business Authority Radio today.
It's my pleasure, Neil. Thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed it. And
to our listening audience, if you like what you hear, hit that like button and share, and we'll see you next time on the show.
You've been listening to Business Authority Radio with Neil Howe and Greg Williams. To learn more about the resources mentioned in today's show, or to listen to past episodes, visit businessauthorityradio.com.